People's Platform.
A very good evening. You're watching the People's Platform, and tonight our topic of discussion would be Draconian laws and the oppressed people of Sri Lanka. To discuss about this and much more, we have invited to our studios attorney Hejaaz Hizbullah. A very good evening, Mr. Hizbullah.
Thank you very much
on the show.
Good evening to you, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course, it's a pleasure to have you. Attorney Hizbullah, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that in Sri Lanka, we see that many laws are being proposed as and whenever the government wants to do so. Then we see it's proposed, it's tabled in Parliament, it's debated multiple times, and then it's also amended multiple times, and the flow goes on. What are your thoughts in how these laws are being prepared and how it's being implemented, and this entire process of lawmaking in Sri Lanka?
I think there is a lot of room for improvement, and also of recent times there's a lot of room for concern also. I'll just share just two recent instances, examples that are spoken about a lot. One is the online safety bill, and which is now an act, and the anti-terrorism bill, which has still not been brought to Parliament for debate. The online safety bill, which in other countries was subject to extensive consultations, was not subject to such a level of consultation at all before it was presented to Parliament. And it was challenged by several challenger petitioners, and the Supreme Court heard submissions for about 3 days continuously. And on the very first day, the hearing was fixed to start at 12 in the afternoon. And from 12 in the afternoon till about, I think, 2:30, the Attorney General was making amendments. So it was very clear that the bill that had been gazetted to Parliament was not well thought out, and that after the petitioners and the petitions were challenging the bill had been presented to the Supreme Court, the government was having second thoughts on a lot of things and was making amendments to make the bill passable. Of course, a submission was made at the outset that the bill should be withdrawn and a new bill presented because there were so many amendments, but that was not accepted, and then the bill went in for consideration by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court suggested, somebody had made the statistic about almost 60 to 70% of the bill was subject to amendments by the Supreme Court, and then once the bill was presented to Parliament and debated and voted, again I believe a few of the amendments were not properly included, which I think was also challenged in the Supreme Court by Mr. Sumantiran. So this is clearly not how lawmaking takes place. We can say the same thing for the anti-terrorism bill as well. Presented once, not placed on the order paper, taken back, then presented again, and now the Supreme Court has made certain amendments to it, or suggested certain amendments, and the bill has of course not been put to Parliament for the debate. These are fundamental laws that are fundamentally changing the ground and the structure and the ground situation for the citizens, and these should be subject to extensive consultations, participation, which has not happened.
So where do you think we're going wrong? Now, usually it's not something you do overnight. These laws shouldn't be implemented or even drafted or gazetted whatsoever overnight. But we see that these laws are so ad hoc. And where are we going wrong? Are we not getting the proper consultation? Or is the government or the lawmakers just, trying to do what they want? Where is the big flaw with our lawmaking?
Well, since I'm not involved with the lawmaking, in the lawmaking process as such, I don't know where we are going wrong. But I think one thing we are going wrong, as you said, is maybe we are doing it overnight. Maybe that is the problem. Certainly one thing we are doing wrong is not publicizing bills adequately enough, and not talking about these issues adequately enough, and not listening to people adequately enough. And maybe that's exactly what the government wants. They don't want people to talk about it. Maybe they don't want public discussion to take place. And maybe that is the problem, and that I think is where the problem is, because if the government does want, then I don't think there's anything that to stop it from doing that. And this has happened in the past, where a lot of extensive discussion throughout the country has happened in certain other instances, but it's not happening now. Maybe the government doesn't want it. Maybe that is the reason.
Of course. Now, when you spoke of public discussion, we know that the online safety bill at first, a lot of people thought it was put out to sort of suppress the freedom of speech, and it will also limit how people express their opinions on social media, especially if it was something about criticizing the government or so on. And now, once the bill was passed, do we see that there is a balance between the freedom of expression, protecting the freedom of expression of people, and also protecting the law? Do we see a good balance between what was just passed recently?
The bill has not started operating in its ordinary sense. As I last remember, the commission under the bill has not been appointed. I think once the commission is appointed, the bill will start functioning proper, and then we will see how the bill operates, and whether there's a balance between the freedom of expression and the safety or the security elements. But I want to say this. One thing about freedom of expression is that people need to feel safe, and people need to feel safe and secure in saying whatever they want to say. Of course, there could be certain outer limitations and outer boundaries, but that arena must be there for them to feel, and that's where the freedom of expression works, or where there is freedom of expression. Now here we are in a studio, we are having an interview, and if you were worried about that, okay, what is this, something wrong what I'm asking, and I'm worried about, okay, will I be arrested as I walk out of the studio, then certainly we are going to be extremely careful about what we are going to be saying here. So that's the problem with the online safety bill, and because it sort of the space has been reduced, and there is a sense of a big brother watching you, and that's problematic. And of course, every law, and that's something that I think we've seen all over the world, laws are only as good or bad as the people who implement it, and that all depends on this commission. So we'll have to see, but certainly at this point in time, from what I see, there is a room for cause for concern with regard to the freedom of expression, because people will worry before they say something because of the spread or the way the law is structured.
So they have really used these laws to sort of instigate some fear in the people.
Yeah. Now the other point, I mean, this thing about anonymity. The online safety bill targets anonymity. Anonymity is a problem. Bots are a problem. Trolling is a problem. But but anonymity is also a part of expression as well.
Because back in the day, you get newspaper articles, books, and all would go anonymous.
Anonymous, yes. And Mark Twain. Do you know Mark Twain? Does anybody know Mark Twain's name? Mark Twain is an anonymous. I mean, that's a pen name. It's a pseudonym. Nobody knows who the real guy is. So now the online safety bill has made that impossible, if not very difficult. So these are things that's going to affect the freedom of expression.
Of course. I'd also like to ask you now, a lot of people say, or at least that is according to the Constitution, the government has no mandate of the people. And how do you think, how viable is it for a government without a mandate to keep proposing bills like this that can affect the freedom of expression or fundamental rights and so on?
It is a problem. It is a problem for the reason that we are in a very unusual period in a country's constitutional history. We had an elected president who had to leave his office. He has to resign his office on public protest. The Prime Minister resigned under public protest. And then you have a president who did not contest the presidential election as such, who's in power. So ideally, this is more like a caretaker government. A caretaker government that is there to ensure that there's an election and that they hand it over to a properly elected government. But we don't see that happening. I mean, we see a government functioning as if they've been elected by the people, and also the things such as online safety and even anti-terrorism, the vast inroads they make into the freedom and liberties of the people, these are matters that should have been subject to an electoral discussion, that should have been the mandate, that should have been in the manifestos. People should have had meetings, political meetings, debates, and then been voted on. So, for example, in 1994, when Chandrika Bandaranaike came in, she proposed abolishing executive presidency and the devolution method. These were things that people spoke about. There was extensive debates, and then she came into power, and then she tried to implement. She failed. That's a separate story. But that's how you come into power with a mandate. And so, but these laws, there was no mandate as such. So there is a democratic deficit that is there here that needs to be addressed.
Of course. Now, it's an election year, and we're unpredictable on who is the clear winner, if there is an election, that is.
Depends on who you're talking to.
Exactly. An election may warrant promises being things like easing or removal of PTA and so on. How do you think these can be possible, and what sort of an idea or what sort of a role will these kind of promises play in terms of leading to an election?
I mean, it'll be great if, so far we haven't seen any political party promising to put this legislative program back. But if they do, then certainly that's an important, and that will be a very progressive development as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. And if they do that, and if they do receive the mandate of the people, then certainly that's something that will be good for, and it's a matter of then repealing those laws. And even with regard to the anti-terrorism bill, I mean, this is a bill that should be debated at a much higher level on the ground at an election. And I sincerely hope that the bill won't be presented to this parliament, but it will be held back for the next parliament to consider.
A parliament with a mandate.
With a mandate, and that at the next election, that political parties will make it an issue. And that should be something that people will think about it and vote, because at the moment the anti-terrorism bill makes very serious inroads onto the freedom of people and makes a substantial change in the law, Sri Lankan criminal law.
Do you think the political parties, at least who seem to be running for the election, are doing enough to create awareness or advocacy about these laws to the general public, to the rural communities and so on?
Not enough. I don't think that these laws are being debated as such. I think, of course, we as a country, we have a lot of other issues troubling us, the IMF program, the economic issues, the inflation, going after the corruption. So those are the issues that are at the front line. But I think these are also important, and I think we need to talk about these things as well. I mean, being a country that has always been in some sort of economic turmoil, we are always talking about the rupees and cents and the price of things. But I think there's also the price of liberty also is something that we need to talk about moving forward. Because at the end of the day, the Aragalaya, the success of the Aragalaya was the liberal, not so liberal, but at least to some extent liberal, legal regime that was there. All those fundamental rights judgments, jurisdiction judgments that the Supreme Court gave, those were the judgments that held these protesters in good state for them to protest and do this. But now that whole regime is being sort of swept away with this new law. So that's something that I think all these political parties who are going in, the new change that they're asking is something that maybe they need to then talk about these issues as well.
Of course. We are crossing over to a short commercial break. We'll be right back. Stay tuned to the People's Platform on TV1.
The People's Platform. Actress Damita and husband arrested. Sirisena temporarily barred from chairmanship of Sri Lanka Freedom Party. Activists demand Election Commission call for delayed elections to be held. Vajira says the presidential poll will be in October and Ranil will contest independently with the support of multiple factions. SLPP's Shehan Semasinghe attends the UNP activist meeting in Anuradhapura. More exploitation surrounding Kiri Samba.
TV1 TV for life.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back. You're watching the People's Platform on TV1. Tonight we're joined by attorney Hejaaz Hizbullah. Attorney Hizbullah, I'd like to drift our attention to the anti-terrorism bill. I'd like to ask you, is it necessary for a nation state like Sri Lanka to have an anti-terrorism bill? Can't the existing laws deal with issues regarding to that nature?
Good question. And whether we need a law or not is something that the people must decide, and that is why I think in the earlier segment I said these are something that has to be subject to an election, and where it's part of the manifesto and people talk about it. There are countries that do not have terrorism laws. There are countries that have terrorism laws that are triggered off. A certain incident must happen and the law comes into operation. Otherwise, the law is kept in suspension. The problem with the anti-terrorism bill that we see today is that this vast set of rules and laws that come in, which were not there when the LTT was actually operating. The laws, this is PTA plus. This is worse than the PTA. But even when the PTA, even when the LTT was in operation, when there was actually a civil terrorism issue going on in the country, we didn't have these laws. Then the question is, why do we need these laws? Do we actually need these laws? So there is a serious question that needs to be asked. Currently, we have the public security ordinance. Where there is a public security situation, the president can promulgate emergency regulations. So there is a mechanism under the current laws without the PTA for the government to deal with emergency situations, and those emergency regulations are then promulgated. They are valid until they are submitted to Parliament, and then Parliament must vote on it. So if there's a genuine public emergency and if there's a genuine need, there's no doubt Parliament will unite in passing those regulations. So to answer your question, my honest legal opinion is that we don't need an anti-terrorism law as such, because there are adequate laws to deal with situations even under the ordinary law. That's number one. Number two is, even if we do feel that we need a terrorism law, it can be a law that is passed, promulgated and is in abeyance to be brought into effect on the basis of some public security emergency. And I'd like to just go back to the Easter Sunday attacks and the Easter Sunday judgment of the Supreme Court. One thing that we do see is that it was not a case of an absence of laws or the inadequacy of the laws. It was that the police did not act on information and clues and material and evidence that they had with them, and that's something that's the whole conspiracy issue that everybody is talking about. So it was not a question of laws.
So you can have 100 laws, but whether they are being implemented and worked on is the question.
So even if they had implemented the penal code to Zaharan and his group, we would have been able to prevent the Easter Sunday attacks. We don't need they did not even have to go to the PTA for that.
You speak about the PTA. So when comparing the anti-terrorism bill with the PTA, what is it like? Do you think it's good, better, bad, or the worst?
Worst. I mean, I don't want to say worst because I think it might even get worse, even more worse. I'll just give you one. There's so many. There's a lot that we can talk about it. I'll just give you one example. Under the PTA, to arrest a person under the PTA, you need the approval of a superintendent of police. So a police officer, a sub-inspector, and that is not every police officer, only a sub-inspector or anyone of the higher rank. A sub-inspector must get an SP's authorization before he arrests a person under the PTA. Why? Because the moment you get arrested under the PTA, the legal procedural regime that applies to you is different from an ordinary criminal. So you get into like say into a special zone, special legal zone when you get arrested under the PTA. So before you put a person under the zone onto that particular set system, an SP must authorize it. Under the ATA, every police officer has that power. So if you annoy your local officer in charge or just annoy anybody, there is a risk of you being subject to a terrorism arrest under the terrorism law. So that's one thing. Another thing that we have is this use of confidential reports, where the reports submitted to the magistrate under the ATA are confidential, not as a matter of exception, as a matter of routine. Every report is a confidential report. I really don't know how lawyers are going to appear before magistrates and defend their clients. And this is a serious problem. Under the PTA, we did not have that. So there is a lot. I mean, we can have a separate show on that.
Of course. I'd also like to ask you, now has this new anti-terrorism bill reduced the likeliness of arrests and detention in comparison with the PTA or in general?
Well, again, how good or bad a law is depends on how they want to implement it, right? So if the government thinks we are going to use the ATA or for people we don't like at every instance,
all those protesters,
yes. So then that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a huge problem. But if the government says no, we are not going to use the ATA, although we have it, we are not going to use it, then of course we don't have that. But certainly if there is a government that is inclined towards using the ATA, then the chances of arbitrary arrest and prolonged detention is at the same level, if not more. It has certainly not reduced. It has not gone. There is no improvement from the PTA, because PTA is a known devil now. Lawyers, judges know what the PTA is. We have found loopholes, we have found ways out, and there's a bit of jurisprudence that had developed around the PTA. Now, Wasantha Mudalige was discharged and released by the magistrate, even though he was prosecuted on the PTA, because to that extent the PTA has become has been tamed. Now the ATA blocks all that. ATA covers all those loopholes, and so it's more robust. So as I said, it's not an improvement. It will be at the same level, if not worse.
You also spoke about those getting arrested, and you mentioned a few examples. Now, with the ATA, does it give adequate safeguarding or safeguards those who have been arrested or detained?
No. In fact, the existing safeguards are taken away. One is, the moment a person is arrested, he is produced before the magistrate. Of course, under the PTA, they were not produced before the magistrate, but police needed to produce B reports. B reports were under the Criminal Procedure Code. Criminal Procedure Code had certain rules on how B reports are produced, how B reports have to be filed. They need to show progress of investigation, etc. These were the provisions, these were the rules that were used by lawyers to attack PTA detention, and then these were the documents that they used to make fundamental rights applications. These were the documents that they used to ask for bail. Now today I got bail for a client of mine under the PTA. Using the B reports, the Court of Appeal granted bail, using B reports, showing what was there in the B reports, and showing that this person, there's a grave doubt as to whether this person is involved, and the court, I'm grateful, granted bail to my client. But under the ATA, none of this is there, because we'll go to court and there'll be a confidential report that nobody sees. What are we going to tell a judge? What are we going to tell the Court of Appeal? What do I know about what's going on behind the scenes? So that's the problem.
Of course. Now, we're supposed to be in an election year, and recently a panel of reputed legal experts spoke on legal reforms that should be introduced for a system change. And one such reform was that the constitution should be amended suitably with a mandatory provision which states that those who cross over will lose their parliamentary seat immediately. Now, sadly in Sri Lanka, we see MP crossovers happening almost all the time. And if you take the history, it has been a normal thing for Sri Lankan politicians to cross over from party to party. They get elected from one party and then they sometimes have a fall off or find a better deal with a different party, and they just give up on their seats and cross over. Now, how practical do you think this reform will be when it comes to implementation, when all Sri Lankan politicians are all about crossing parties for their benefits?
Well, under our law, if you cross over, you stand to lose your seat.
We saw that happening quite recently.
In Nazir Ahmad,
yes.
You stand to lose your seat, but you don't lose it immediately. You have the right to file a petition before the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court will deliberate on it and decide whether your removal from the party, because always after the crossover there's a disciplinary inquiry and there's a removal, whether that removal was justified. And so there has been a stream of a line of cases coming from, I think, when Mr. Amir Ali crossed over, that has emphasized on MP rights and the MP rights to due process and fairness, etc. This led to this crazy situation where when the party summons you for a disciplinary inquiry, members of parliament don't even turn up. Because they just say, they just ignore it in toto. Now, Nazir Ahmad was a situation like that, where the party wrote to him and he didn't choose to respond adequately, which the Supreme Court has now set right. But going back to your question, should they lose their right, lose their seat immediately? Maybe we should try that. Maybe we should try that and see. Maybe now the current situation is you cross over and then the party terminates your membership. You don't lose your seat. You get to go to the Supreme Court, and until the Supreme Court decides you keep your seat. Maybe we should go the other way. You lose your seat unless the Supreme Court puts you back in. Maybe that's the system that maybe we need to.
System change.
Maybe that's a system change we need to think about.
Of course. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on the People's Platform. Attorney Hejaaz Hizbullah. That's all the time we have for you tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow at the same time. Till then, take care and good night.